Thank you so much, and it's my pleasure to join you all today. And I'm so excited about our next speaker, or our keynote speaker, Barbara Lau. If you are not familiar with the legacy of the Reverend Dr. Pauli Murray, you are in for a treat. Barbara Lau is currently Executive Director of the Pauli Murray Center for History and Social Justice, which is a national historic landmark site in Durham. And the legacy that that landmark provides us is the opportunity to learn about the life of the poet, the lawyer, the activist, and the priest, Reverend Dr. Pauli Murray. Anchored by Murray's childhood home, the center focuses on history, education, the arts, and social mobilization, of course, based on her life's work. Since 2009, Barbara has served as director of the Pauli Murray Project at Duke Human Rights Center, which is also part of the John Hope Franklin Humanities Institute. Lau brings over 20 years of experience as a folklorist, a curator, a professor, an oral historian, media producer, and author to this work. This is a phenomenal woman. Her credits include producing To Buy the Sun, an original play about Pauli Murray, co-directing The Face Up, telling stories of community life, community mural project, and curating Pauli Murray, Imp, Crusader du Priest, and also 2 major exhibitions about Cambodian American traditions. Lau received her bachelor's in urban studies and sociology at Washington University in St. Louis, Missouri, and her master's in folklore at UNC Chapel Hill. She currently also teaches undergraduate courses about Durham and LGBTQ history and culture. She has been in Durham Bull City since 1991, long enough, I think, to almost be a native.
Almost.
But I have the pleasure now of turning the program over to Barbara Lau. Welcome, welcome.
Thank you so much, Mary, and it's just a pleasure to be with everyone today and to be able to be looking at the history and legacy of this amazing person, Pauli Murray, in relation to this time of year when we celebrate Women's History Month, the time of year when we celebrate African American History Month. So it's my pleasure to be with you today, and I bring you greetings from the Pauli Murray Center for History and Social Justice. I want to start today by thinking about where Pauli came from, and I think that's really valuable because it connects Pauli Murray to Durham, it connects Pauli Murray's legacy, and, you know, how did Pauli Murray become this amazing person whose life really intersects with all of the major human and civil rights movements of the 20th century. You know, people don't just come out of nowhere. They are influenced by their families and their communities, and we believe that that's a really important connection to make for Pauli. So let me start by sharing a little bit with you about Pauli's family. Pauli's grandparents, Robert, George, and Cornelia Smith Fitzgerald, who you see here on the screen, and Pauli's aunt, Pauline, who actually raised Pauli after Pauli's mother, Agnes, passed away. Agnes and William Murray lived in Baltimore, Maryland, and quickly had 6 children, and this really took its toll on Agnes, and unfortunately, when Pauli was a small child, Agnes had a cerebral hemorrhage. Of the 6 children, 5 of them stayed in Baltimore with William's family, but Pauli, who was actually born Anna Pauline, came to Durham to live with her aunt and her namesake. In this picture, you can see that Aunt Pauline looks a little stern, and she was an educator for more than 60 years in the Durham public school system. But Aunt Pauline loved Pauli fiercely, and together with her sister Sally, they really helped to shape Pauli Murray. But it goes back even a generation farther. Robert Fitzgerald was a Union Army and Navy veteran who came south after the war to fight what he called the Second Great War, the war against ignorance, as a teacher, as someone who was working to help shape the future citizens, people who had been enslaved and were now able to more fully engage in citizenship in the United States. And so it was in this household of these very principled and opinionated adults that Polly grew up. Polly graduated from Hillside High School in Durham, would have been the valedictorian, but didn't always get the best grades in conduct, which we translate as Polly speaking back sometimes to their teachers. And Polly went to New York to go to college, wanted to go to college in an integrated environment, was drawn to New York because some of their teachers at Hillside had attended summer programs at Columbia University. So Aunt Pauline and Polly head off to New York to go to explore Columbia, only to discover that Columbia is only admitting men. And they send her across the street to Barnard, where they discover that they don't really have the financial means to attend Barnard, and those folks suggest Hunter College, which is part of the New York State system. Polly arrives at Hunter College with transcript in hand, only to discover that they need 12 grades of education, not 11, which is what's been offered in the South, in order to even apply a Hunter. So Polly stays with a relative in the New York area, establishes residency, and completes an amazing amount of academic work in 1 year that would enable Polly to apply to Hunter and be accepted as one of 4 African-American women in Hunter. Polly graduates in the middle of the Depression, and like many young people in this period of their life, Polly's trying to figure out, you know, who am I? Who do I want to be? Who do I want to be in relationship to? What kind of job do I want? What kind of mark do I want to make on the world? And it is in this time that Anna Pauline becomes Polly. Polly, a more gender-neutral name, officially changing her name later in life when she's an attorney, but really drawn into all the possibilities of a place like New York City in the 1930s. We're lucky to have great documentation of this through this wonderful photo album, The Life and Times of an American Called Pauli Murray, which includes these 2 pictures, the dude and the imp, along with the vagabond, the crusader, the poet, Polly imagining herself in these multiple ways, and also discovering that there's some disjuncture, doesn't quite feel right just as a woman. Is there feeling a little trapped in the constraints of what women were expected to be, what women were expected to have, what kind of ambitions they were expected to have, and actually reaches out to doctors during this period to ask about new treatments that are happening in Europe using hormones to help people more align with the gender that they feel comfortable with. But Polly is also so in touch with the constraints of what is considered appropriate for women, and realizing that this is not the constraints that they want to take on in their own life. Does not receive hormone treatment. This is not something that doctors in America are very keen on. It's suggested that Polly just try to conform to what is expected of women and femininity. That doesn't go over so well either, and Polly continues to chart their own way in the world. After doing some work for the WPA and learning more about labor relations and trying to work as a writer, Polly's aunts call and say, you know, we think you maybe need to come back to Durham and help take care of us. By this time, they're in their 60s. They're starting to think about retirement. And so Polly thinks, well, maybe I can come back to North Carolina and sort of kill 2 birds with 1 stone. I realize in my career that I need an additional degree, so maybe I can go back to school and take care of my family. So Polly in 1938 tries to enroll at UNC Chapel Hill in a graduate program in sociology that is focused, in fact, on race relations. She is denied admission due to state law and policy of the university. And maybe this could have just floated by, but at the same time, the president at the time, Franklin Roosevelt, has visited UNC and declared it a progressive Southern university. Look what you're doing. Well, this just incenses Polly. But instead of keeping that to herself, Polly writes a letter to the president explaining why this is incorrect. The university is not progressive. If they were progressive, they would be accepting students like Polly into their programs. And smartly, Polly also carbon copies, and I know there's some people on the call who remember what carbon copies are, but or CCs that letter to Eleanor Roosevelt. Now, Franklin doesn't really write back, but Eleanor does. And this is the kickoff to a very important mentorship and collaborative relationship that Polly and Eleanor have throughout the rest of Eleanor's life. This has been beautifully chronicled in a book called The Firebrand and the First Lady. There are more than 300 letters that they sent back and forth, and they really become a sort of formidable duo, encouraging Polly, sending letters to Eleanor, telling her what she thinks Franklin should do, and Eleanor's trying to help Polly navigate situations that Polly finds herself in, you know, and it's really a great correspondence, and it really helps us understand the evolution of power and protest during the 20th century. After working on a death penalty case in Virginia, where Polly goes on the road trying to raise money for a sharecropper who has been convicted by an all-white jury and sentenced to death in a crime that was really self-defense, Polly meets some lawyers who are very engaged in the civil rights actions of this time. They're also out on the road trying to raise money, and they suggest that Polly, being very articulate, really creating these great arguments, should consider law school. Polly sort of says, well, if you can get me a scholarship, I'll come. And that, in fact, turns out to be true. Leon Ransom, who is the dean at Howard Law School at the time, or a professor, finds a scholarship, and Polly enrolls in Howard Law School, starting out in a class with 2 women, but ending up being the only woman in her class, and discovers some things while there. So this is an all African-American environment, and Polly finds that she's being discriminated against because of being a woman. And so she turns this over in her head and crafts this idea of Jane Crow, the overlapping oppressions that Polly is experiencing due both to gender and to race, something we might now call intersectionality. When Polly is excluded from various activities at the law school, she sort of just takes that as a challenge, and in fact studies hard, works hard, and graduates at the top of the class. Now, traditionally, the person in this position receives a fellowship to continue their education with the idea that they would come back to Howard to teach. And usually they take that fellowship with them to Harvard University. So Polly says, why not? And applies to Harvard, where Polly is promptly denied access because of her gender. And in this great letter she writes to Harvard, she says, gentlemen, if the way to change my gender has not yet been revealed to me, so I suggest perhaps you could just change your mind. And despite having references from Franklin Roosevelt and others, Polly still does not gain access to Harvard. Instead goes to the University of California's Bolt School of Law, where she completes the LLM degree and becomes the first assistant attorney general, Black assistant attorney general in the state of California. But again, family calls, and that is, California just feels too far away, and so Aunt Pauline and Aunt Sally encourage Polly to move back to the East Coast. Again, they're getting older and thinking about what to do in retirement, and so Polly returns to the East Coast and tries to set up a law practice in New York, which doesn't go so well. It's unfortunate that people weren't seeing the brilliance and the skills that Polly had developed with these 2 law degrees, and she's not able to continue this practice. And so they decide to turn their attention back to writing. An essay they began at Hunter it starts to become evolving into this amazing memoir, which I recommend to everyone, Proud Shoes, which says a lot about early Durham history, says a lot about civil rights and the sort of roots of activism. And Polly receives a great commission from the Methodist women who ask them to put together a book that chronicles all the laws related to race and color in every state in the United States, which, if you can imagine trying to do prior to the internet, is quite a bit of work. 4 years later, this pamphlet they've commissioned is actually a 700 or 800 page manuscript, which becomes Polly's first book, States' Laws on Race and Color. Thurgood Marshall refers to this book as the Bible for civil rights litigators, and it continues to be a resource as people are doing this kind of history of the law, history of civil rights. A few years later, Polly is able to publish Proud Shoes in 1956. Aunt Pauline and Aunt Sally had come to live with Polly in New York City and helped with the book, but unfortunately neither lived to see the publication. It received some great acclaim at this point, and in fact later in the 1970s, after the Root series on television, the book is republished as people really are beginning to discover the powerful stories of African American families and their relationship to the way we understand democracy and freedom. Later on in Polly's life, they published a book of poetry, Dark Testament, in 1970, and then posthumously an autobiography, Song in a Weary Throat. So we think about the way that Eleanor Roosevelt looks at Pauli Murray as a firebrand, and in fact we see this evidence throughout Polly's life. We see the ways that Polly has challenged higher education at UNC. Polly is actually arrested in 1940, 15 years before Rosa Parks, for sitting on, refusing to give up a seat on a bus in Virginia, while at Howard helps to lead undergraduates who are doing sit-ins at local restaurants, again, 1944, prior to the 1960 sit-in movement that really takes off across the country. Coins that term Jane Crow. You can see by looking at this list that throughout Polly's life, there are these examples of ways that Polly is inviting us to think about the world differently, think about race, gender, sexuality, gender expression, all these things in new ways by drawing on their own experience and continuing to seek a world in which they could actually contribute all of this brilliance, all of these ideas, all this energy for fighting for justice. Polly is able to get a job in the late 1950s at a white shoe law firm in New York City, Paul Weiss, where Polly meets their partner, Irene Barlow, who is a fellow Episcopalian. But at the end of the 1950s, Polly has a real moment of anger. There's been a lynching in Mississippi that just sort of pushes her over the edge, and she actually leaves and goes to Ghana to teach constitutional law in Ghana, who has recently won their freedom. She stays there about 18 months, and then because things are changing in Ghana, feels that they need to come back to the U.S. and trying to figure out what they are interested in at this point, Polly applies for a JSD, the PhD level law degree, and returns to Yale. In 1965, Polly is the first Black person to gain that degree, to be awarded that degree at Yale Law. And in fact, Yale University has recently renamed one of its, or actually named one of its new undergraduate campuses, Pauli Murray College, to honor Polly's achievements there. Polly, in the 1960s, gets more and more involved in gender-based equality movements, helps to found the National Organization for Women in 1966, works very hard and testifies in front of Congress about the inclusion of sex in Title VII of the 1964 Civil Rights Act. Polly's experience as a researcher, as a speaker, these are all drawn upon at this point. Polly making the argument that if the 1964 Civil Rights Act is actually aimed at advancing the issues of African American women, sex needs to be included because Black women don't always know, am I being discriminated against because of my gender or because of my race? So it's important to offer all of those protections. While Polly's at Yale, she's also able to mentor some of the younger students that are sort of coming up through the ranks, people whose names we know well now. Eleanor Holmes Norton, who represents the District of Columbia in the Congress, and Marian Wright Edelman, the founding director of the Children's Defense Fund. So really understanding this human rights work as a relay race, understanding how you're taking the baton from the generations that have come before you and handing it off to the next generation and trying to foster those connections. As I shared before, lots and lots of achievements in Polly's life, educational achievements, recognition by Mademoiselle magazine as one of the young Black women to watch, publications. Later on in Polly's life, recognition through the Episcopal Church, and that is actually continuing. So another really big turning point in Polly's life, Polly is, after finishing that degree at Yale and doing some work for the Office of Economic Opportunity, but not getting the top job that they applied for, in part because of their political affiliations, because of their sexual orientation. Polly makes the shift to higher education, first at Benedict College in South Carolina, and then later as a tenured professor at Brandeis. But in 1973, when Polly's partner Irene, who you see on the screen now, died of cancer, Polly was called upon at the end of Irene's life and the end of Aunt Pauline's life to offer what solace Polly can muster because there is no priest to be able to find, and Polly feels drawn to this new vocation. So after Irene passes away, Polly actually leaves that tenured job that they had fought so hard to get and decides to go back to school yet one more time to enter the seminary. It's at this point that Polly is saying to herself, you know, I've been working in law, I've been working in policy, I've been working in civil rights, but for me, these issues of human rights are moral issues. And so now is the time to explore moral leadership through the church. Polly and Irene had been fighting long and hard for changes in Episcopal Church policy that would allow women to become priests. And Polly fully expected when entering divinity school that 1 year later at the triennial convention of the Episcopal Church that they would make that policy change. They would allow women to become priests. Fortunately, it doesn't go so well, and Polly, in fact, has to wait for another cycle, so it's 4 years later when Polly is able to become a priest. I include the picture here of the headstone for Polly, which is in Brooklyn, that includes Polly's chosen family. So Aunt Pauline and Aunt Sally, also known as Sarah, who have come to live with Polly in New York, then Polly, then Polly's partner Irene, and Irene's mother. In 1977, Polly is officially ordained as an Episcopal priest at the National Cathedral in Washington, D.C. And as this quote demonstrates, seeing this as this moment when all the strands of life are coming together, the circle is being completed in bringing Polly to this place of faith leadership. So this is an amazing life. Polly actually spent her final years in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, and died in 1985, having almost completed, having completed but not seen the publication of their autobiography. And I think the question we had to ask ourselves as we were doing the Face Up project, which was really aimed at lifting up and amplifying the work, the voices, the people of Southwest Central Durham who are working to improve their quality of life, the artist we worked with, Brett Cook, came to Durham and in the process of getting to know Durham, discovered this story of Polly Murray. And like many people have said, I don't know, why don't I know about this person? This person is amazing. This person is someone I can relate to and I can see myself in. And so of the 14 murals that were created through the Face Up project, these 5 focus on Pauli Murray, and 4 of them are still out there. You can see them. There's a map of them on our website, paulymurraycenter.com. But it reminded us to think, well, what about this? You know, how can we lift up this life and legacy? How can we begin to follow the lead of Pauli Murray in thinking? And I know you can't quite see this so easily, but there's a quote in one of these murals. It's my favorite quote from Proud Shoes. "It has taken me almost a lifetime to discover that true emancipation lies in the acceptance of the whole past, in deriving strength from all my roots, in facing up to the degradation as well as the dignity of my ancestors." So this call for us to be reckoning with the past, for us to be working to uncover and lift up the whole past, the past that includes the degradation and dignity of all of our ancestors, and to think about, and again, in this mural in the bottom, the one that's in downtown, about building true community. You know, a community that is reciprocal, that is mutually, that includes equality and dignity for all. So as we were thinking about this in our work in Southwest Central Durham, it led us to realize that we needed to lift up Pauli Murray, and we needed to continue this work. And so the Pauli Murray Project and then the Pauli Murray Center were born. And the kind of work that we do does lift up additional underheard voices or amplify those voices, engages people in dialogues like this post-election reflection recently, tries to offer support, in this case, support for lawyers who are representing protesters, thinks about engaging people in Pauli Murray's writing and writing by other Black and queer art, authors, and thinking about how we spread this news of Pauli Murray, how we invite other people like Brett Cook did to see themselves in Pauli's story, to be inspired by Pauli's story, to lift up this the Reverend Dr. Pauli Murray in their life and in their work. We've done that through this exhibit that was mentioned that opened originally at the Levine Museum of the New South. It wasn't really designed to travel, but we had so much interest that we brought it to Durham in 2015, and then in 2018, we're able to take it to New York and share it with more than 10,000 people there. We also commissioned this original play, To Buy the Sun, which premiered during Pauli's centennial in 2010-2011. We represented it, rehosted it in 2016 in Durham, and again, we're able to take it on a tour in 2018, first to New York, then to Pauli Murray College in New Haven, Connecticut, and finally to Howard Law School in Washington, D.C. You know, Pauli's ministry was really recognized by the Episcopal Church, and in 2012, Pauli became St. Pauli Murray, St. Reverend Dr. Pauli Murray, by being included in the Episcopal Book of Holy Women, Holy Men. And every year in July, we collaborate with the Pauli's family's home church, St. Titus Episcopal on Moline Street in Durham, to have an annual service to remember Pauli's witness and to think about what Pauli calls us to do today. It's open to everyone, and it's always quite an inspiring event. In 2011, the folks in Southwest Central Durham alerted us. They had shared with us before, shared with folks around the community before, that Pauli's childhood home still existed. It was built in 1898, and in 2011, it actually was slated to become a parking lot. So we were able to, with the support of the Southwest Central Durham Quality of Life Project, purchase the house in order to begin the process of renovating and rehabilitating it. Took a few years to get the city of Durham to do some work in the Maplewood Cemetery right behind the house that had had 100 years of detrimental impact on the foundation. But once that was finished in 2014, we started our work first with the National Trust for Historic Preservation through the National Treasures Program, and then with the support of Iron Mountain to renovate the house and to try to bring it back to being a location where Pauli Murray's story could always be accessible and available to folks. So this gives you a sense of the transformation of the house. This is a picture from 1910. 100 years later, in 2010, you can see the sagging roof, the broken chimneys. You can see that the windows have changed, the porch is different. So we had to remove all those quote-unquote non-historic materials, jack up the house, rebuild the foundation because it was sagging in the center due to all that water damage, take off that front porch that had been added, and bring it back to what it looks like today, which is as close as we can determine through research to the original color of the house, the original window pattern, and the original porch. And we're very excited that this site will continue to be renovated. We're working on the interior now so that it can be a place that welcomes everyone who wants to learn more and be inspired by the Reverend Dr. Pauli Murray. In 2016, at the very end of the year, actually December 23rd, our application to become a National Historic Landmark was approved. We are North Carolina's 39th National Historic Landmark. We are the first in the state focused primarily on women's history, and we are the first in the United States focused on a person of color who is also LGBTQ. So one statistic that I think is useful is that there are 95,000 sites listed in the National Historic Register. Of that, only 2% focus on the stories of African Americans. It is not much better for women, and it is much worse for LGBTQ folks. So it is really important to have these locations where people from fifth graders to retirees, from folks who are coming for workshops or retreats to people who are just history buffs can come and learn more about the contributions, the brilliant thinking, the accomplishments, and the struggles of people like the Reverend Dr. Pauli Murray. I can't say enough about how important it is that we have these locations. One of the things that we do is we do walking tours with our partner from Whistle Stop Tours, Aya Shabu. I actually call them walking performances because they're unlike other walking tours that you've been on, about the neighborhood that puts Pauli and Pauli Fitzgerald family. There's many more stories about, for example, Pauli's great uncle, Richard Fitzgerald, who was a brick maker and became a very wealthy businessman and community leader in Durham. There's many stories to include in the walking tour that gives a sense of the West End neighborhood and also Pauli and Pauli's family's place in it. We hope to open the historic house this year, this fall. We're working now, with the support of a National Park Service grant to renovate the interior, to replace a rear room addition that was completely decimated by the water, and to invite people inside for the first time. Pauli is really being recognized, though, these days in the media. You may have seen Pauli Murray featured in the new Amend Netflix documentary series about the 14th Amendment. Pauli Murray really was considered the mother of the feminist legal strategy, which is all based on the 14th Amendment, and an inspiration to Ruth Bader Ginsburg and Ruth's work to fight for women's rights in the Supreme Court. You can see that Pauli's name is included in a national bill that seeks to uplift the contributions of people, of Pauli and other fearless trailblazers. There's been a recent, I believe it's a 3-part series on WUNC's Tested podcast series with Leonida Inge, a great radio personality and researcher. And both our own Raleigh News and Observer and the Oprah magazine have included Pauli in lists of civil rights leaders that we need to know more about. And it is true, we need to know more about people who are like Pauli, who have been excluded from the historical record, from our high school textbooks, from our college curricula often, because of their sexuality, their gender identity, their political stance. It's very important that we bring all of the stories of American history to the forefront. Some of you might have noticed that recently there's a new documentary film, My Name is Pauli Murray, that is premiered at the Sundance Film Festival in January and February of this year, and was recently purchased by Amazon. It will be released in the fall as a major film on Amazon and may appear in some additional festivals. We are working closely with participant media to think about all the ways that the film can be used in classrooms and in community settings and libraries that in the future. So look for more of that. And finally, and I look forward to your questions because this is such a huge story and it's hard to contain in a short period of time, but there are much more to find on our website, paulimurraycenter.com, including at the bottom a way to join our newsletter so that you can learn more about the programs that are upcoming. We do lots of different dialogue programs, and hopefully soon we'll be able to have more in-person programs when it's safe. But there's also biographies, both of Polly's writings, which are listed here, and some writings about Polly. This is just the tip of the iceberg. There's so many young scholars that are looking and writing about Polly that it's just really exciting to see all the ways that people are thinking about the kinds of ideas, the actions, the inspirations, the intellectual work that Polly did, and the ways that Polly is connected to today. I often joke with people and say, we are finally catching up to Pauli Murray. Polly was so ahead of their time that just constantly, Eleanor Holmes Norton actually in a new introduction to one of Polly's books said that Polly pulled history along with her. So I hope that all of you have enjoyed this. I'm excited to hear more about your questions. And again, thank you so much for having me and allowing me to introduce you to this amazing North Carolinian who has really impacted the world. There's one women's history scholar who said that when American historians of the 20th century look back, all roads lead to Pauli Murray. So we hope to be able to welcome all of you to our site in the near future, and I look forward to your questions now.
Thank you, Barbara. And anyone who has questions, just put them in the chat, and Ryan will get those and ask those of Barbara. But I have a few questions for you now, Barbara.
Okay.
You just shared so many astounding firsts regarding Pauli Murray and her many talents and achievements. But overall, until recently, you just named those things that are coming up. But overall, she's pretty much been a hidden figure, right? Despite the fact that she accomplished far more than most historical greats of any race. And it seems she had a very humble spirit and wasn't about fame or being in the spotlight. But that level of distinction and excellence and accomplishment doesn't get overshadowed by humility. Do you think it was public awareness of her gender dysphoria or her gender nonconformity and the fact that she didn't meet others' expectations or fit into any one box that led her to not being a household name today?
That's a really good question. Thank you so much, Gina. I think that's absolutely a big part of it. So there are a couple of moments in Pauli's life when they have the opportunity to be more on a national stage, to be more facing forward, to be more powerful as a policymaker. One of those is a job that Pauli was up for in the 1950s and had, Eleanor Holmes Norton wrote one of the recommendation letters, but despite that, Pauli did not receive the job because of their quote-unquote past associations. Even when Pauli was attempting to engage the NAACP in representing her as she was trying to gain access to UNC, the rumors of Pauli's sexuality didn't make her the ideal defendant. She didn't fit the box there. And later on, I think the biggest example of this is through the 1964 Civil Rights Act, the federal government created the Office of Economic Opportunity. And Pauli was enlisted to be the general counsel as a contractor in the initial startup days of that new organization. And Pauli then applied for the full-time position, which would have really put her in the driver's seat about many of the cases that were coming up about disparities, not just in the ways jobs were advertised, in the ways people were treated in the job site, all those kind of things. So this is what created an FBI file in part for Pauli Murray, because when you apply for a job like that, you have to list every location, every address you've lived at for 3 months or longer because you're a senior official. This then prompts the FBI to look into and validate all those locations. But obviously the research into Pauli went much deeper, because in that FBI file,
Uh-oh.
Hello? Barbara? I think we have some technical difficulty from Barbara's side, and hopefully that will come back real soon. A reminder, I said to send your questions to the chat. Please send them to the host. And if you have your mic unmuted, please mute that. We're getting some background noise. Hopefully we will have Barbara back soon. In the meantime, what we can do, and then just pick back up with the questions, is have Mary share some information. If we don't get Barbara within the next couple of seconds, we can have Mary share information, and I will turn that over to Wendy to lead that out for this program that's coming up that Mary has planned.
Hello, I'm certainly able to are you able to hear me?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay. While Barbara goes back out and comes back in, I think that'll...
In what Pauli was able to do now.
Yeah.
So I'm hoping
Barbara,
that's working for
Barbara,
us now.
One
yes.
second. We missed a lot of what you said. It was like your screen froze. So if you can kind of recap that just a little bit for us. And we seem to have lost her again. Go ahead, Mary.
Okay, maybe if I start talking, she'll come back in. Well, that was so exciting. I actually have started reading the book that Barbara referenced, Pauli Murray, The Firebrand and the First Lady by Patricia Bell Scott, and I encourage you to pick up that book. It is a thick book, but it also is full of her words, her writing, and her story. And when I read about her story, I think about her advocacy for women's rights, her advocacy for the rights of African Americans. She spent half of her life advocating for the rights of African Americans. And then she says in the book, I spent the other half of my life advocating for women's rights. I mean, she basically helped created the vision for the National Organization of Women. And she did that based on the NAACP model. However, she left that organization after a year because of the politics and the lack of recognition of her role and her contribution. And then she also, in her work and her journey to sainthood, let's say, she started focusing on human rights. So to me, Pauli Murray, the Reverend Dr. Pauli Murray, is a prime example of what we're talking about when we talk about the intersectionality, right? That women experience and women of color experience, and then also women of LGBTQ women, right? The intersectionality. And in our work at the North Carolina Council for Women and Youth Involvement, we released a series of reports entitled The Status of Women in North Carolina. And the data is segmented by gender and race. And so you can see whether it's the Status of Women Employment and Earnings report, which was the first report we released in 2017, that shows very clearly, number one, gender discrimination is alive and well, that women at all levels make less than men, that women of various educational levels, whether you have less than a high school diploma or a master's degree, make less than their male counterparts with similar educational levels. So we are still living, even though we've made advances, we're still living and women are still experiencing that gender inequality and intersectionality. And 1 in 4 women we know in North Carolina are working in service occupations, and we now, due to COVID, have a different perspective of essential workers, right? And we're talking about in our latest reports on the status of women political participation and in exploiting inequity. We hear from the voices of women who are sharing with us the challenges they're facing in terms of making those decisions to leave the workplace to care for their families and to care for their children who have been at home for the past year, right? Because who are the caregivers? Women. And so we have a long way to go, even longer now, due to COVID-19, but the story of Reverend Dr. Pauli Murray is just so inspiring. So thank you, Barbara, for that. I want to share with you a quote that just touched my heart from the book. And the quote that the Reverend Dr. Pauli Murray shared was this: if anyone should ask a Negro woman what is her greatest achievement, her honest answer would be, I survived. I survived. We certainly understand that more and more now, don't we? I survived. But she lived overcoming so many barriers, and yet her legacy is inspiring because she did continue. She was resilient. She persisted. And so it's so appropriate that we are acknowledging and recognizing and learning about her during Women's History Month. The North Carolina Council for Women and Youth Involvement is sponsoring a Women's History Month program on March 31st, and I encourage you to join us and register for that program. It allows us to highlight the information that's in our latest report, the status of women political participation, but also allows us to feature some success stories by women of the Bull City. Durham has again set a record for having an all-female county commission. Voters elected a 100% female county commission. And so we have the honor of listening to the chairwoman of that commission, who is Chairwoman Brenda Howerton. She's joining us on the panel. Also, Durham has the distinction of having elected the first Muslim American to the county commission. And Commissioner Nita Alam is going to join us and share her experiences and journey. Also, Durham is distinctive in that it has 2 women's commissions, the Durham County Women's Commission as well as the Mayor's Women's Commission. And both of the chairpersons of those commissions will be joining us, as well as the chairperson of the Council for Women Advisory Board appointed by Governor Cooper, who is Jenny Black, who also heads up the Planned Parenthood organization as executive director. So that will be held on March 31st, 12 noon, and I encourage you to register. We're going to learn lessons about women's leadership, but also how you and your communities where you're living and working now can learn how to create your own women's commission in your community. The thing about Pauli Murray, when she saw an injustice, she spoke up. She didn't keep it silent, but she also reached out to policymakers. Her relationship with First Lady Eleanor Roosevelt sort of set the stage there, and started not only that friendship, but started her path in terms of making her opinion and recommendations for improving policies for women, for African Americans and others known to those individuals who could make a difference. And so, again, Wendy, you have to stop me when you want me to stop, because I could continue.
Thank you. You've shared quite a bit, and we appreciate that, and I hope folks will participate. We do seem to have Barbara back, I'm told. Barbara, can you hear me?
I certainly can. Can you hear me?
Yes, ma'am. And if you would please just recap what you were saying. We lost connection with you, and would love to hear you finish responding to that question.
Sure. I'm not sure where you lost me, but let me just say that I think that today we are open. We are open to thinking about a life like Pauli Murray's in its complexity in relation to our ideas about gender, race, sexuality, gender presentation, non-gender conformity. And I think we're ready to say that what matters is that this person is bringing these great ideas, is inspiring us to be active, is inspiring us to speak out, is inspiring us to live our lives, to seek wholeness, and to create a world that Pauli dreamed of, a world where someone like Pauli could be fully recognized and Pauli's ideas could have the influence that I think that they deserved then, and that they are beginning to, we're beginning to see some fruition, so it's coming to some fruition now. Pauli used to say, I've felt that they felt lucky to have lived long enough to see some of their lost causes found. And I hope that we can continue Pauli's work, because as I always say, knowing Pauli's story is great, it's important. I hope that all of you will go and tell 10 more people about Pauli Murray, but knowing it is just the first step. The next step is living into the kind of activism, the kind of mindset that Pauli is sharing with us. So thanks for that question, Gina, and I'm sorry that I got cut off. I'm not sure what happened on my end.
Oh, no problem. We're glad to have you back. I have a quick question, and then you just mentioned activism. That brings me another question to mind. Real quick, though, which do you think shaped her social and political insights more? Was it racism, sexism, or sexual identity, or do you think they were just equally there? I just want to know, which do you think propelled her most to do all the great things she did?
No, I think actually that love is the answer to that question. So Pauli Murray's aunt deeply, deeply loved Pauli, and they taught Pauli to live by their own choices, but they made space. Even in the 1930s, when Pauli Murray would write home and say, I don't know whether it's me or the medical establishment or the world that seems to be against me, wanting to deny me who I am, but I know what makes me happy. So Pauli Murray's aunt encouraging Pauli to live into who they were, to honor their own experience, their own feelings, and not to have to conform or fit into someone else's box. I think led Pauli to believe, and also the work. Pauli's aunt Pauline fought for better pay for Black teachers in Durham. Pauli's grandfather was such an important person in early Durham history and amongst his students. And just that idea that our job on earth is to try to make the place better for everyone. I really think that's what drove Pauli. So then when Pauli saw that injustice that was based on race, when she would guide her grandfather, who by the time he was older had lost his sight due to a sniper's bullet during the Civil War, she would lead her grandfather downtown, and she saw Jim Crow. She saw what he had been fighting for and what he was now being shut out of. She went to Howard and experienced discrimination based on gender. So by honoring their own experience as a whole person, they kept pushing at the boundaries, challenging the civil rights movement to be recognized the way it discriminated against women, challenging the women's rights movement to recognize the way that it was not serving women of color. Polly was never really able to be out as in public during their lifetime. There were just, the risks were so high, the price was so big, they would never have been able to be ordained as an Episcopal priest had they been publicly out. Many, many people around Polly understood Polly's full identity. But I just think that really that love of self that Polly learned from their aunts, and that idea that love was such a powerful force in the universe, was really what influenced Polly along their path.
Mm-hmm. That's really profound, and I love that you shared that, because it underscores the importance of family and authenticity in developing a solid foundation that could, lead to the courage that she had, and also the fact that her Aunt Pauline, her permissiveness and her understanding on the part of Polly's gender identity. It seemed like she leaned into that and allowed her to be who she was, and allowing her to wear, the boys' clothing and all of that. That just says a lot about what family can do in being there, being available, and being understanding of someone, and how that person can end up spreading their wings and growing. I could just go on about that, and I won't, but I just love that you shared that. My question about activism, having fought against socially, racially, and sexually opposed divisions for most of her life, do you think that that Polly would say, and what do you think really she would say about, I won't put words in your mouth or hers, what do you think she would say about Black Lives Matter and Me Too?
Maybe, wow, great, like, so glad to see you all in the streets. That's a really interesting question, Gina, because when the Black Power movement was really building its agency and its visibility in the 1960s, Polly was resistant, right? Polly felt like, I'm not just Black, because of Polly's own family history, being Black, white, and Native American. But I think that Polly would, and Polly was always a big nonviolent, really a proponent of nonviolence. So when Polly's building, where Polly's office was at Brandeis, was taken over by the Black students, and it was just above the chemistry lab, and there was some threat that, they were going to blow up the building, or that could happen even accidentally, that really upset Polly. And Polly felt a bit out of step with the young people. And I think that we see that again today, that as always, it's the young people that are leading the way. The young people of SNCC were so instrumental in the civil rights movement. Young women were so powerful in second wave feminism. So I really think that Polly would be excited that there are people out there who are claiming their truth, who are saying, no, the world owes me better. The world, I shouldn't just sit back and take discrimination based on my gender, or sexual harassment, or realize I had to do X, Y, or Z to advance in my career. I think Polly would be very excited that these kinds of stories and the power that comes with telling those stories is coming to much more prominence. Many more people are thinking about this. People are on notice that you cannot get away with, you cannot believe that you can just say things and act in certain ways and discriminate against people just because you're a powerful person, and that no one's going to hold you accountable. I really think that idea of accountability was really important to Polly, both as we're accountable to ourselves, but how we're accountable to one another. So I think Polly would be, I think Polly might be, as an older person, might be saying, hey, let's stick with the nonviolence, but I think Polly would be very supportive of all the energy and the power of the current movements for Black Lives and the Me Too movement.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. But she's well known for the quote, "What is often called exceptional ability is nothing more than persistent endeavor." And no one would argue that she was anything less than exceptional. But do you think that this quote was based on her insistence on showing the world how much harder she unfairly had to work to gain opportunities she should have been entitled to, or was she genuinely unaware of how rare and truly extraordinary she was?
Well, that's a great question in the sense of how much self-awareness was going on. So one of the reasons that we're able to, that the filmmakers can make the film, that we have such insight, that scholars have so much ability to write books about Pauli Murray, is that for whatever reason, Pauli knew that their life was important, and they saved everything. When you go to the archive at the Schlesinger Library for Women at Harvard and Radcliffe, where Pauli's papers are housed, there are thousands of folders of material that Pauli Murray saved and gave to the archive. Everything from their vet bills to their tax returns to their journal entries to clippings to personal legal papers, notes. This is back before computers, so when you were drafting books, you would do typed multiple revisions. All those things are in the archive. So Pauli knew that this was important, and Pauli left behind the material about seeking hormone treatment and being under the care of mental health professionals. Pauli left that behind because they knew we would be looking for that. We knew that she knew that that was an important part of the story, and so we have to thank Pauli for that. But I agree with you, Gina. I don't think Pauli was, despite at one point when I guess it was when there was an opening on the Supreme Court, and Pauli literally wrote a letter to President Nixon suggesting that a Black woman like herself would be a good addition to the Supreme Court. But that was very unusual to be like sort of putting herself forward. I do think Pauli Murray was a very humble person, and was very committed to the cause. So it's interesting. I think that quote also gives us insight into the fact that, as well as the journals, that Pauli worked all the time. I'm not sure that's such a great model for all of us today, but Pauli was constantly working at night, or people who tell stories about visiting Pauli talk about the walls and walls of books and questions about it. And it's like, oh, well, that's the one shelf I haven't read yet, So very much energetic and ambitious, but I think the self-care was difficult, and there was more. It was a little bit more like a roller coaster of exhausting herself and then having to retreat to write and think and ponder and be away in order to rebuild the internal energy that it took to hold the position, right? So many times in Pauli's life, we see examples of moments when she could have settled. She could have just stayed as a tenured professor. She could have stayed at the law firm. They could have continued, gone back to Howard perhaps as a professor, and yet they did not choose that. Pauli continued to choose the edge and pushing the edges of the movements that they were involved in, of our ideas about the relationship between civil rights and women's rights, about the conception, as you see in the bibliography. Pauli wrote something really arguing about how these were human rights, how we needed to think about these in more holistic ways. I hope that sort of answers your question.
It does. It does. Wendy, do you have some questions there? I don't know if Ryan has them. If you want to share those from the chat.
I do have those, Gina. I can
go ahead, Ryan.
Sure,
Thank
absolutely.
You.
I can go ahead and share those right now. First question for you, Barbara, was Pauli's books were published by the Methodist Church, yet she became an Episcopalian. Why was that?
There's one simple answer to that, and her name is Thelma Stevens. So Thelma Stevens was the leader of the Methodist women, and someone who was a great activist and motivator in her own right. I think that Thelma met Polly and recognized the capacity that Polly had and used the resources that she had available to her through the Methodist Women's Organization to be able to support Polly's work, but also to create the materials. Once that book, States Laws on Race and Color, was published, they found the funds to make 1,000 copies of it and send it to law schools and ACLU chapters and other folks to make it available. We have to remember that at that time, the folks that were working to get cases up the ladder into the Supreme Court had to think really carefully about which laws to challenge and what would be a precedent-setting decision that could be appealed and pushed into the Supreme Court so that it would affect everyone. And this is where that book, Polly's book, came into play, where local civil rights attorneys could really find the laws in their states that made the most sense to challenge. And so in some sense, that network of women, Thelma Stevens, Eleanor Roosevelt, others, you know, Polly also knew several, I'm trying to think of her name, the president of the Council of Negro Women. It's right on the tip of my tongue. But, you know, was amongst in these communities of women who were drawing from the resources that they did have access to try to lift up these ideas and these younger activists.
Thank you. Next question from the chat. You mentioned that Polly's family was very strong in the West End neighborhood in Durham. Would Polly's accomplishments be included on the Blackwall Street history in Durham?
So this is where Polly's great uncle, Richard Fitzgerald, really is a connector. Richard Fitzgerald was the first president of Mechanics and Farmers Bank, which was located on Blackwall Street. He also became, in addition to his brick-making business, he purchased real estate and helped to create the neighborhood and the opportunities for home ownership in the West End by selling people property. He and a group of other African-American men were the first Black men to own a textile mill near Concord, North Carolina. So Polly's story is very connected to Blackwall Street through Richard, but also when Polly was trying to save money to go to college, they took sort of a gap semester, a gap year, and actually worked at North Carolina Mutual. So this was just so many ways that there were interconnections between folks in the Hayti community. St. Titus Episcopal, the church that Polly's family worshiped in, was located and is located in the Hayti community. So there are a lot of interconnections there through family and through activities. I should also say that Polly's Aunt Pauline was also very good friends with many of the educational leaders in Durham, and that also, many of them were also founders of North Carolina Mutual and North Carolina and Mechanics and Farmers Bank.
Thank you, Barbara. Gina, that's all we have from the chat right now.
Okay, thank you, Ryan. Well, Barbara, we have a little bit of time left. I have a question for you, specifically about your work. You stated in your presentation that all roads lead to Polly Murray, and I'm pretty sure people get the full picture of what you meant by that. But can you help us lean into that narrative a little bit more and also share how you ended up on one of those roads to help undertake this great work and establish the center? What drew you to Polly?
Excellent. I think that as we look at Polly Murray's life, and I hope that educators in the future will take advantage of this, Polly Murray's life, which spans a good deal of the 20th century, is really a great backbone for teaching about 20th century American history and thinking about the ways that what we often think of as separate issues, separate movements, separate action are actually very connected. So I think that the scholar who said that was really giving us an insight into ways to see things in a more connected way as opposed to as distinct movements or distinct actions. My work with the Polly Murray Center really started, as you heard in the introduction, my training is in folklore, and one of the things public folklorists believe deeply is that wisdom and meaning are embedded in the communities of creation. So, for example, if we're looking at, say, an egg basket, someone from the outside might examine it based on its form or its color or the thinness of the strips, whereas inside the community of people who are raising chickens and using these egg baskets and making them, they would say, well, if the eggs break, it's a bad basket. If the eggs can fit safely in it, then it's a good basket. So as we think about that in relation to community history, and I was starting work at the Center for Documentary Studies at Duke. My job was to help support community-based documentary work. As I started to meet people in the West End neighborhood, in the Lyon Park neighborhood, in the Birch Avenue neighborhood, what those places meant was not for me to say. I could drive through, and I would often taken people on tours, and you look at an abandoned house or something like that, and I can say, well, you might see this as an outsider, like a blemish on the community, but in fact, it is an asset because right now that property is owned by the land bank of the Southwest Central Durham Quality of Life Project, and it's getting ready to be redeveloped based on the leadership of these folks from the community. So the idea of what we see is not what we see really ties into that notion about public folklore. So as I was learning more about the neighborhoods, the way to learn about them was to talk with people and to listen to the stories of folks that grew up in the West End and who had been activists in the West End and Lyon Park, who helped build the Lyon Park School, which was the pride of that particular neighborhood, and is again the pride of that neighborhood, and to really help give meaning to those places by what I was learning from those folks. And it was those people who grew up in the neighborhood and who had cared about its history that said, this place is important. You saw what it looked like. It was abandoned when no one had lived there for several years, when we were able to realize the opportunity of the Pauli Murray Childhood Home. But it was people in the neighborhood who schooled me and helped me understand what that meant, why certain places in the neighborhood were so important, why certain stories of the neighborhood were so important. And so when we had the opportunity to save that property, we jumped on that because we recognized that it was important to people in the West End. And then it just kind of built from there. So first we had to interface with the city about the issues of the drainage. Then we had to think about, well, we know about that, and we're learning about that, but we also realized that as people come from outside, they're giving this place even a different meaning, even a different importance. Pauli Murray's story, a different importance. So how do we build upon that and make connections with people like the National Trust? And some of that, to be honest with you, Gina, I really believe that Pauli's spirit made a lot of that happen. One small story, the person at the National Trust that nominated us to become a treasurer was coming to Durham from South Carolina because of a health issue and whose doctors were at Duke Hospital. And on one of those trips decided, well, let me check out what these folks are doing. And that started this whole snowball effect. This has happened to us more times than I can tell you, that the resources, the connections that we've needed to move our work to the next level have kind of shown up. And I truly attribute that in some way to the power of Pauli Murray's spirit, but also to the way that this story resonates with the issues that we care about today and the work and the world that we're trying to create today. So I was drawn into that. I worked at the Center for Doc Studies for 10 years. That mural project was the last big project that we did. And as the attention about the Pauli Murray story was gaining, the Duke Human Rights Center approached me about developing the Pauli Murray project with them, a way to think about that, grappling with the real past, the whole past of Durham. In Durham, we tell ourselves lots of stories about how we get along or don't get along, and that doesn't always match up with what happens. And so if we as a community can grapple with that past and learn about how to do that, how can we share that with people outside of Durham and moving that forward? And then as that position has grown, we've launched this separate nonprofit, the Pauli Murray Center for History and Social Justice. to steward the future of this place and to try to build on the work that we've gotten started by bringing this place online as a visitor accessible and ready site, but as also a launch pad both physically, which I think is really important, and in the virtual realm for the dissemination of Polly's story and the spread of the inspiration. Of course, we always need help with that. It's been a long fight that continues. We're trying to also renovate an adjacent historic house into a welcome center, education center, because the childhood home has fairly small rooms, and people, you know, we want to be able to have an entire class of 5th graders or an entire group of seniors or teachers or whoever. So we really need that space next door. So we're now also trying to raise funds to bring that space online to give us more options for programming, engagement, and convening more people at our location.
Well, that sounds wonderful. I see that we're running short on time, and I understand. I just got a message that there are more questions in the chat. However, we're going to ask if you would like to connect with Barbara, if this is okay with you, for folks to reach out to you at the center, and if they have any questions that way, they can get them to you. Or we're happy to, in OSHR, we're happy to get those questions. You can send them to myself or Wendy, and we will get those to Barbara for you to get answers either way. But right now, I'm going to turn it back over to Wendy for the close. But I want to thank you, Barbara. You are so wonderful, the information you shared. Thank you so much for your time. And Wendy, I'm handing the ball back to you.
Thank you so much, Gina.
Thank you, Gina. And Barbara, again, thank you so much for your time and coming out and informing all of us about Reverend Dr. Polly Murray and the Polly Murray Center. The information has just been so informative, and I'm just fascinated about her life and really everything that she stood for. And so again, we'd like to thank you. And on behalf of OSHR, we would like to thank you again for representing the Polly Murray Center as we observe Women's History Month. And this event has been recorded, and it will be posted out on social media later on this week. So if you will look out, I will send out an announcement stating that that this recording will be posted. Or so you can look out for that information. You can also go back and reference the Women's History Month proclamation that was sent out by Governor Cooper. And we would just like to say thank you for attending this event, and we look forward to bringing other events like this to your attention. So if that's all, thank you and have a safe afternoon.